All right, me. It's immediately after the Royal County All-Stars, and I'm now going to be talking about my second reading, which is when I was also teaching Shakespeare's Scottish play, Macbeth. Um, I have this version out. This is the No Fear Shakespeare version, right? And as can be seen, the way it's written out is you have the original Shakespeare on one side, and then you have an amended version written in modern English on the other side. Now, when I taught this to the seniors I was teaching, we did use the No Fear Shakespeare version, right? And I'm gonna have my thoughts on it, right? No Fear Shakespeare is great in terms of connecting, right? If you are working with students that are not particularly interested in reading and not particularly interested in trying to read Shakespeare, right? The No Fear Shakespeare is fantastic, right? It is easy to comprehend, right? It gets to the point, right? You don't get as much fun with it, but it makes it much easier to get the ideas of what's happening. The problem with No Fear Shakespeare is it leaves out so much of the questioning about what's happening, right? Because it fills in a whole bunch of blanks, right? Original Shakespeare, right, as you go through and you read it, has a whole bunch of things that are missing or are left up to the interpretation of the director who's putting it on. And part of that has to deal with the fact that, right, presumably Shakespeare wrote it and then helped support direct it, and then they just performed it, right? And so he didn't need to put a whole bunch of these notes down because, number one, right, he was there to direct it. Number two, if you put those things down at that time, well, that's how you get other theaters presenting your thing that you wrote, and you're not getting paid for it, right? And so, right, the original Shakespeare's were dealing with a lot more of like estimating or not guessing, but understanding through context what's supposed to be happening, right? Even sometimes who's supposed to be on stage, right? But No Fear Shakespeare takes away all of that, and they fill in a whole bunch of those blanks, right? No Fear Shakespeare also tends to make assessments on what's happening, right? Rather than sometimes seeing the irony or sometimes giving that up for interpretation, right? The big thing where that comes in within Macbeth is the witches, right? The whole thing with the witches is to me at least, you're supposed to be questioning whether or not these witches are actually real, right? Or if they are in some ways some sort of hallucinatory or fake, or, are they real people but they don't actually have powers, right? And the No Fear Shakespeare version just kind of takes all of that out, right? It doesn't leave a lot for interpretation and talking about what's happening. Right, the witches in this, right, to me are very interesting. I don't remember what I said initially, but having gone through and redone this and taught it, right, that's the big thing, is I taught this, is that the witches allow for so much more exploration of what's happening, right? And the big thing for me is, do you interpret them? To me, there's three ways to interpret them. Are they actual witches? Are they real people that are pretending they have powers? Or are they completely figments of imagination in some way, right? And I'm inclined to go with the second one, that they are real people, but they are, they don't have powers in that sense, right? So that's that. Teaching it was fun, right? And I enjoyed it a lot more teaching it than I did reading it initially. part of that just comes down to where I was at that point when I was reading it, right? I was reading it at the very end of my last in-person college semester. And I was slogging through it. It was the 8th Shakespeare that I had read in a row in 16 weeks or 15, 14 weeks or whatever. And so, I was burnt out on Shakespeare. But this, right, came at the end of teaching for the first time, of where I got to do a lot of open-ended things. I got to play a game with it, which was fantastic, right? We didn't get into a whole bunch of the underlying issues that come with this play, because really what we focused on mostly was the greed and the wealth and power that shows up here. We also talked quite a bit about toxic masculinity or masculine traits and how they are portrayed here. And I don't know, that's a thing where, because I had their paper due right at the end of my student teaching, and then my host teacher went and graded them, I don't know how those ended up turning out, right? But I do feel that I may have missed the mark there, because I don't think I fully explained those concepts well enough, right? Because I think we inherently understand what the term toxic masculinity means, but I think it's a missed mark, and people don't necessarily understand that, like, toxic masculinity is not just about men being toxic. It is traits that we deem towards men, or how we think men should act in a society, and how those harm everyone, right? Because, right, there's a big thing of where, like, we expect, right, the big thing that comes to mind right off the bat is that this concept that, like, men in a Western society should not express their emotions outwardly, and should not show fear in any sense of the word, right? Or show hesitancy. Right? That's a thing that's still being talked about to this day, right? And one of the things that this play shows is that, well, that ends up actually harming way more than what anyone else can do, right? Because we have this whole thing with masculinity, in which it comes to I think I talked about in the first one about, who do we blame for the murder of Duncan? Well, one of the things you can blame is this toxic masculinity, of where all of this happens in like 2 days, in which Macbeth finds out that hears the prophecy where he should be king. His first thought is violence, right? Which is one of those toxic masculine traits. And then he goes, there has to be some other way. There has to be something else here. But what happens is, his wife, Lady Macbeth, is the one that goes, yes, you were right in your inclination, right? But now, and then Macbeth does it, and he's terrified by it, right? He hates that he's done it. But Lady Macbeth upholds this toxic masculinity that exists in society, where she's like, grow up, asshole, right? You've done it, now just deal with it, right? Don't cry about it, don't whine about it, don't be upset about it, right? Go hide. I'll take the daggers and go hide them, right? You gotta man up, right? And it's really that phrase that encapsulates it all, is that phrase of man up, right? Because in reality, if we had taken the time, everyone had taken the time to attempt to think about what they are feeling, right? To think about how they wish to express themselves, right? I'm sorry, it's all these damn liberal ideas that are coming out, right? But like, if maybe we had just thought a little bit and maybe tried to compose and comprehend our own emotions, maybe this entire thing wouldn't have happened, right? But it comes down to this whole thing of like, if you expect both men and women to exist and live in a very specific way in society, well, then you get these issues, right? Because not only do they put it on themselves, but people around them put it on them, right? So, right, and I don't feel that I did enough explaining on that part, right? So, I don't know if any of my senior class of 2024 was listening to this right now. My apologies, I didn't explain that enough to you. We also talked about, femininity a lot in it. And what that means. We talked about the role of women in the Shakespeare society and whatnot, specifically that of patriarchal women, women that exist in the aristocracy, right, and what their role is, right? We talked a lot about that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to really mention about things that we really, really, really talked about. No. The game was quite fun with it, right? I tried some fun things with it, and that worked out. I did some things where I planned out some murders, and I planned out things were going to happen, and I planned out some uprisings, which, gave a lot of enjoyment to it, right? Out of the classes that I had one class that didn't necessarily buy into it. They bought into the idea that like they could get out of taking the test, but they didn't get into the whole game thing. But the other two classes did really, really well in getting into it. And I think part of it, number one, just has to do with attitude, right? I had the one class that presented some issues throughout the entire year, but we got through it. But part of it is also just timing, right? And sometimes that just can't be helped, right? Because there are certain classes that are inherently difficult throughout the day, right? The first class and the last class of the day are inherently difficult, right? Because you're either dealing with kids that are not awake and they don't want to be there at this time because that's not the function that exists within most teenagers of waking up early, right? That's not a thing that most teenagers do just naturally, right? And last period of the day, you're dealing with a lot of kids that don't want to be there anymore and are tired and are burnt out throughout the day, right? I really enjoyed how the school was set up in terms of that last period in which that was the student resource time, right? Because number one, that is needed in schools, but also it is just nice to know that the last period of the day is last period of the day is the time in which, right, you're not forcing kids to try to learn something. That is time for them to work on stuff as they see fit. Other difficult classes are right around lunch, right? Period before and period after. Those are always difficult ones, but that also can't be helped, right? But yeah, right. And I think part of it was also just in terms of my enthusiasm towards classes, right? Because students bought into it more in certain periods, I'm more inclined to try to keep their attention and work with them and do all those fun things with them, right? And that's on me, right? That's something that I have to learn how to deal with as an educator, right? Um, so, once again, apologies. But that's that. I think that's everything to talk about with the Scottish play. I don't think there's anything else. All right.